Hello everyone, I am Chandana Alavattage and welcome to my lectures on content analysis. And this topic is divided into three lectures. The lecture 1, conceptual foundation of content analysis. And the lecture 2, technical and procedural aspects of doing a quantitative content analysis. And the lecture 3, technical and procedural aspects of doing a qualitative content analysis. So, in this lecture, I will be concentrating on what and why aspects of doing a content analysis. Whereas in my next two lectures, I will be discussing how aspects of doing a content analysis. As usual, let us begin this lecture by clarifying our learning objectives. The primary aim of this lecture is to provide you with a broad conceptual understanding of the topic. And that primary aim is spelled into two specific learning objectives. So the learning objective 1, after following this introductory lecture and after reading the recommended reading materials for this topic, you should be able to define and describe content analysis as a research methodology. Learning objective 2, yet again, after following this introductory lecture and most importantly, after reading the recommended readings for the topic, you should be able to justify the use of content analysis as a research methodology. In other words, you should be able to explain the conditions under which content analysis would become an appropriate research methodology to use. Here we are discussing a research methodology, content analysis as a research methodology. Therefore, it would be a good idea to start our discussion with a very fundamental, basic question. What do we mean by research? Yes, what do we mean by research? Yes, I know, it is a difficult question to answer. That is because research comes in so many different varieties and people do research in so many different manners. Therefore, it is very difficult to provide a single, universally accepted definition of research. However, for the purpose of this topic, that means for the purpose of understanding content analysis as a research methodology, I would define research more empirically or pragmatically. In that sense, I would say research is a systematic or a scientific process through which we make certain knowledge claims about particular reality problems or reality situations. If I repeat it again, research is a systematic or a scientific process through which we make certain knowledge claims about a particular reality situation or a reality problem. Now, in this definition of research, there are three key elements. The first key element is that there should be a reality problem or a reality situation that we are trying to explore, that we are trying to understand, and that we are trying to explain. Now, second element of our definition is that there is a process, systematic or a scientific process, or in other words, a methodological process. A process in which we follow a certain set of research methodologies, techniques, and tools. So that's the second element of our definition. And the third element is by following that particular methodological process, by using such research methodological tools and techniques and so on, we make certain knowledge claims about that particular reality situation or reality problem. So that is the outcome of the process, the third element. So we will have an argument, an explanation, a conclusion, a thesis, and so on about the particular reality situation that we want to explore, understand, and reveal. So that's our basic definition of research in order to understand the content analysis as a research methodology. Now, keeping that definition in our mind, we should have a brief discussion about, a little bit more discussion about the first element, the reality problem, or the reality situation that we want to explore, understand, and explain. In your research, this reality problem or the reality situation appear as your research problem or research issue. And that is the most fundamental or most important or central element of your research project. And it is the ideal starting point of your research project. A good research would normally start with a well justified, clarified, and very well defined research problem. And such a research problem would provide the basis upon which you would derive your research aims and objectives. And everything else in your research project, everything else in your research process would be directed towards answering or addressing that research issue. So therefore, defining and clarifying your research problem is a very important element of your research project. You would normally do this in the very first chapter of your dissertation or the very first section of your research paper, the introduction part or the introduction chapter. So there you will explain very clearly the background of the research problem, and then you justify why you should spend your time and effort in addressing this particular research issue. And then you will spell out your research issue very clearly, and then also you might clarify your specific research aims and objectives that you would derive from that research issue or the research problem. So after all, the research problem or the reality situation is the ideal starting point of your research, and it provides the basis upon which everything else has to be decided. Now, with understanding that the reality situation or the reality problem constitute the most fundamental or the key element of your research project or the research process, we have to pay attention to another important question. How do we come to know the reality? In other words, how would the reality become visible to us? How would the reality appears to us as researchers? There's a direct answer for that particular question. How would the reality become visible to us? Through data. Data is the key answer here. So you come to know the reality through data. So therefore, in empirical research, in research that you use content analysis, data constitute one of the key or the fundamental elements. Now, when you are talking about data, as you may already know, there are two types of data, primary data and secondary data. And the differentiation between this primary versus secondary data is important to understand the use of content analysis as a research methodology. So how do you differentiate between primary and secondary? The primary data is those data which you yourself as a researcher collect and construct. So as a researcher, you go to the reality. You get closer to the reality and you see it. You listen to the reality and you understand it and you record it. And then you have a set of data that you yourself created. That's primary data. For example, you might use a method called direct engagement method. So as a researcher, you might have a wonderful opportunity of getting involved in the reality situation or the reality problem that you want to explore, understand and explain. So you might have the opportunity of go and participate in a board meeting, a committee meeting, or any other technical process in the company. You may be able to work as a particular person in an organization. So by engaging directly in the reality process, in the practice, you may come to know the reality. And then you create your own set of memos, notes, various kind of video clips and so on. So that's primary data because you yourself created it. While some people may have such wonderful opportunities of getting involved in the reality directly, many of us do not have it. So therefore, instead of going and doing a direct engagement or direct participation research, you might go and talk to the people who was a part of the particular reality situation. You may talk to the managers, accountants, lawyers, customers, clients, and so on. So you converse with them, you interview them. You might have semi-structured interviews, structured interviews, or unstructured interviews. But still, you ask the question, you record them, you transcribe them. So it is the data set you yourself created. It's a primary data. Or sometimes, even without having interviews, you may design a questionnaire. You may design an opinionaire or a survey instrument. And then using such questionnaires, opinionaires, and survey instruments, you still collect data. So you design that survey, you design that questionnaire, and you collected that and you created the data set. It is primary data. And using such primary data or primary data collection methods, you collect the experience, opinions, attitudes, values, beliefs, and so on of the particular set of people who are engaging with the reality. So that's the primary data. However, there's a very important point to emphasize here. Such primary data is not the focal attention point of content analysis. Content analysis would normally not deal with such primary data. Yes, I understand and I know there are certain techniques of content analysis. For example, certain systems or methods of coding, such as primary coding, axial coding, and so on, may be used or can be used in analyzing primary data. That is true. But however, as an overall research methodology, the content analysis is not about primary data. Then, content analysis is about secondary data. So secondary data are those data which is created by the reality situation itself when the reality takes place. It is not a set of data that you yourself as a researcher creates. Now, when the reality takes place, when an actual practice is going on, when people do things in their organizational settings, in their social settings, in their political settings most of the time, when they do things or when the reality takes place, the reality itself create a set of data. In other words, reality get textualized by the reality itself into different forms of text, such as words, paragraphs, numbers, stories, narratives, pictures, images, videos, and so on. So that happens when the reality is happening. For example, if a person is born in a hospital with the help of doctors, midwives, and nurses in an operation theatre, so that particular operation or that set of activities happening in that ward or hospital will get recorded according to the rules, procedures, techniques, and norms set by the medical profession as well as by the administration of that particular hospital. So the doctors, nurses, and midwives will follow all these procedures and record whatever they are doing in that particular setting according to the standard practices. So the practice or the reality is structured, the reality is organized in such a manner. When that reality happens, the reality get recorded or reality get textualized. Similarly, when a transaction takes place in a market, the transaction will get recorded. The accounting system, transaction processing systems will record, summarize, capture, and report all these transactions using various sort of accounting devices and techniques. So the whole organizational activities are organized and structured in such a manner. When such transactions takes place, they get automatically recorded or textualized. So once this reality gets textualized, the reality will become a text. And that text will reproduce the reality. For example, when a person is born, she or he will be issued a birth certificate. The birth certificate is not only a proof of the fact that this particular person is born on that particular date at this particular place, but also the birth certificate reproduces the reality. Because the birth certificate will give a name for the person, an identity for the person, an ethnicity, nationality, race, and so on. So there is a connection between reality and the textualized forms of reality. And this textualization or the textualized form of reality is what we call secondary data. So when you look around, you find loads and loads of secondary data. Sustainability report, corporate report, company web pages, news media, social media reports, social media accounts, and so on. So there's a loads and loads of data created by the reality itself. So as a researcher, you can use them to understand the reality. So those are the secondary data. And the secondary data is the type of data that content analysis would deal with. However, when we are thinking about the secondary data, there are two forms of secondary data: quantitative secondary data and qualitative secondary data. Certain reality situations are such that the reality creates a set of data which is fundamentally numerical, quantitative. For example, the market transactions are in their very nature, in their very native form, a quantitative reality. When a transaction happens in a stock market or output market, the transaction would have a quantity and a price. They are by nature quantitative, numerical. So therefore, a market transaction gets recorded originally in its original form as a what? Quantitative data. Example, stock market prices, stock market quantities, stock market indexes, and so on, demands, supply, and so on. They are all quantitative data. So they are all secondary data but quantitative nature. And here is the important point. Such quantitative secondary data or such secondary quantitative data is not the focal attention point of content analysis. The content analysis would not deal with such quantitative data. For example, stock market big indexes, databases, you don't use content analysis to deal with them. You can use econometrics. You can use various other forms of statistical analysis. but not content analysis. Then, content analysis primarily deal with qualitative secondary data, the data that reality creates but in qualitative form. Other than market transactions, there are so many other real situations, real practices, corporate conditions, where the reality get textualized into not the numbers but into words, stories, narratives, pictures, images, and so on. In most of the situations, the reality is not numerical, even though there are some numbers may be involved. Those numbers are not the defining character of that reality. The defining characteristics of the reality is a qualitative thing, a story, narrative, something happened. So they get recorded in qualitative sense. So what do these qualitative data involves? Words. Actually, most of them words, not the numbers. And those words will be constructed into stories, narratives, reports, and so on. For example, we have annual reports, we have corporate reports, we have newspaper articles, and we have social media content. So these are qualitative secondary data. And those are the type of data that the content analysis would deal with. So, to repeat and emphasize, content analysis is a specific research methodology that primarily deals with qualitative secondary data. In other words, it is the qualitative secondary data that would be used by the content analysis. Now, if we get back to our learning objective 1, we mentioned that we should be able to describe and define content analysis as a research methodology. Now, on the basis of the nature of data or the type of data that a content analysis would normally deal with, we can define content analysis as a particular research methodology that would primarily deal with qualitative secondary data. However, when we are talking about content analysis, there are two forms of content analysis, or there are two types of content analysis: quantitative content analysis and qualitative content analysis. And it is very important to understand that both these forms, whether it is quantitative content analysis or qualitative content analysis, both these content analysis techniques or forms deal with qualitative secondary data. So, even when you are talking about the quantitative content analysis, the type of data that a quantitative content analysis would deal with is qualitative secondary data. So data will always be qualitative secondary data. However, the analysis will be quantitative. To repeat it again, data will be qualitative, but the analysis will be quantitative. What do you mean by that? Now, in the case of quantitative content analysis, what's going to happen is you are trying to translate, or you are going to convert originally qualitative secondary data into numerical data in order to use statistics so that you can test hypotheses. Now, if you are a positivistic researcher, if you are a quantitative researcher, you would normally make your knowledge claim. You would normally advance or explain your argument on the basis of testing a set of hypotheses. That's what we call positivistic research tradition or doctrines. The knowledge is established by testing hypotheses. To test hypotheses, you need statistics. To use statistics, you need numbers. But when you come to the secondary qualitative data or the content analysis, you don't have numerical data. You have qualitative data. You have reports. You have words. You have social media contents. You have newspaper contents, stories, narratives, images, pictures. You don't have numbers. Now there is a problem. There is a words, narratives, paragraphs, and so on. But you want to use statistics in order to test a hypothesis. What do you do now? So you convert these originally or in their native form qualitative data into numerical data by counting. For example, how many times a particular word, a particular concept, a particular theme, or a particular variable appear in this text. So you count the words, you count the paragraphs, you count the pages, and so on. And then convert these words, paragraphs, and so on into numbers. So that is the analysis. The data is qualitative, but you analyze that in such a manner. In the process of analysis, you convert the qualitative data into numerical data so that you can use statistics to prove hypothesis. That is the quantitative content analysis. But on the other hand, qualitative content analysis. If you are a post-positivistic researcher, if you are a qualitative researcher, you are not trying to do hypothesis testing. You are not trying to generalize from a sample into a population using statistics and hypothesis. Instead, you want to tell a peculiar, interesting, a unique story. You want to construct your knowledge or your claim of knowledge as a narrative. So in which case you don't have a necessity, you don't have a need, you don't have a purpose to translate this qualitative data into numerical data. You wouldn't do that. Sometimes you may do that, but that is not the primary purpose. So in which case you can use these qualitative data as they are. So if you are using such qualitative secondary data in their native form, as words, pictures, images, paragraphs, and so on, then you are doing a qualitative content analysis. So still, the data is qualitative and analysis is also qualitative. And in the other side, quantitative side, data is qualitative, but the analysis is quantitative. And it translates the quality into numbers or quantities. And here, you use the quality as a quality. So that's the difference between quantitative content analysis and the qualitative content analysis. Whether it is quantitative content analysis or qualitative content analysis, it involves reading of the text or systematic reading of the text, either manually or with the help of a computer software. You read the text, or in other words, you read the textualized reality in order to understand the reality through the textualized reality. So that reading process, the systematic process of reading, is called coding. And coding is the key analytical process of content analysis. So the coding involves systematic reading of the text in order to identify salient, defining, or characterizing features of this particular text. That means you would read the text, yet again, either manually or with the help of computer software, in order to identify, defining, or characterizing or salient words, concepts, themes, variables, occurrences, instances, and so on. So such things like variables, concepts, occurrences, themes, and so on tell you what would this particular text tell us about the reality which created this particular set of text. So that is the technical process of analyzing the secondary data using content analysis. And we will discuss about this in detail in our second and third lecture. Now, coming back to our learning objectives. In the learning objective 1, we mentioned that we should be able to define and describe content analysis. So if I am going to describe and define it, I would say, as I already mentioned, content analysis is primarily a research methodology that deals with the secondary qualitative data. And the content analysis can take two different forms, either quantitative or qualitative content analysis. In either case, content analysis involves systematic reading of the textualized reality or the secondary qualitative data. And the reading can be either manual or a software assisted. In either way, that reading of the text is directed towards identifying key terms, key variables, key concepts, instances, occurrences, and so on that define the text, that characterize the text, so that through the text you can have an explanation, an understanding about the reality that created that particular text. So that is the description of content analysis. That is our understanding of content analysis. Now, if we move to our second learning objective, we mentioned that we should be able to justify the use of content analysis. That justification stems from the specific connection that I already mentioned between the reality and the textualized reality. And this connection between reality and the textualized reality, I would call the duality between the reality and the textualized reality. The duality basically means the reality itself textualizes into a text, and that text will reproduce the reality. For example, in a corporate board meeting, committee meeting, that meeting will be minuted, recorded in minutes, and that minute is the textualized reality of that report. That textualization may not be perfect, that textualization may not be 100% transparent, but that is the way the reality is organized in order to textualize itself. So there is a textualized reality. So the board meeting minutes, and that minutes will be read in the next meeting, and the necessary actions will be discussed. So the next month meeting or a board meeting will be affected and influenced by the minutes of the previous meeting. So that's, you produce a textualized reality, and that textualized reality will reproduce the reality. So this connection is what I call duality between reality and the textualized reality. Now, as a researcher, our main purpose is to understand this particular reality. So in order to understand that particular reality, if you are a primary researcher, so you may go directly to this particular reality situation and try to collect the data. And such data may not be, such opportunities may not be available. And such data may be partial, or such data may be not providing a kind of acceptable answer. But if you look at this textualized reality, those are the data created by the reality itself. Therefore, this set of data, which is created by the reality itself, provide a good window, a good pathway, a good gateway to understand the reality. As in the case of any sort of data, such data may not be perfect. I accept that. Everybody should understand that. But they provide a good basis upon which one can go back to the reality. So the content analysis is a method which concentrate on this textualized reality. Provided that we have lots of such data available in our world, in this contemporary world. So which methods provide us the opportunity to use them? Content analysis. For example, as a research, accounting or finance researcher or a student, you have a lots of access to company reports, sustainability reports, and so on. Expose a draft and accounting, say, accounting standard bodies, various kind of minutes, meeting minutes, and so on. So you can use them. So such data is available, so you can use them to get back to the reality you want to talk. So in the next 2 lectures, we will talk about them more. We will talk about what sort of how these particular textualized forms of reality can be used to talk about the reality that you want to talk about. Those are the things that we will be discussing in the next 2 lectures. So that's basically, we are coming to the end of this lecture. So to summarize, this lecture was about the conceptual foundation of content analysis. So in this lecture, we basically had 2 learning objectives. We were aiming at defining and describing content analysis, which we did, and then justifying content analysis as an appropriate research methodology. And when we are talking about, or when we are describing and defining the content analysis, we do that on the basis of the nature or the type of data that a content analysis would use. So in that regard, we emphasized and we understood that the content analysis primarily use secondary qualitative data. And such secondary qualitative data may be analyzed either quantitatively by converting or translating them into numerical data so that you can use statistics to test hypotheses. Or you may use such qualitative secondary data in their original native form as such, as paragraphs, as words, as images, and so on, to illustrate, to articulate your point. So that's how we say. And then when it comes to justification of content analysis as an appropriate research methodology, that justification should stem from the duality between the reality and the textualized reality. So thank you very much for listening to this lecture. Until the next lecture, which is quantitative content analysis, techniques and procedures.